What's up, everyone? Welcome to the Back to the Future, the podcast that takes a trip down Philly sports memory lane. I'm your host, Jim Montgomery, and it's been to say it's an interesting week this week in Philly has been an understatement, and for once, it has nothing to do with our sports teams. Hopefully, everyone is safe out there with all the smoke from the wildfires. I know I'm recording this on Thursday. I know Wednesday night it was pretty bad. It seems to be it cleared up a little bit today, but it seems like now it's starting to get a little bit worse, but not nearly as bad as it was yesterday. And by all accounts, it should be moved out. So hopefully by the time, I hope you always listen as soon as I post, but I know some people wait a few days when they get some free time. So hopefully if you're listening to this and it's a few days from Thursday, you're dealing with, I heard there's actually rain in the forecast. So hopefully we're moving on and we're breathing some fresh air, and hopefully that washes away the pollen as well. But welcome again to Back to the Future. Be sure to like and subscribe, spread the word, tell one person, tell them to tell one person, and let's get this thing spreading, much like the wildfire. I was almost said it, and then I realized it was going to be a pun, but pun intended now. Let's spread this thing like wildfire. We have a lot of good things going on both on this Back to the Future as well as my daily podcast, This Day in Philly Sports History. Be sure to check out both. Like, subscribe, leave a review, comment. Every little bit helps with the algorithm. Like I mentioned, we're trying to grow this. And speaking of growing, one of the ways we grow is through partnerships. One of the partnerships we have, I have some other things in the works right now, is with phillygoat.com. Father's Day is coming up. And you know, if you listen to This Day in Philly Sports History, I've been telling you all about their shirts. Go to phillygoat.com. Check out their selection of Philly-based apparel. It's amazing, whether it's Phillies, Sixers, Flyers, Eagles, city-based. They have neighborhood T-shirts. It's Pride Month. They have Philly Pride shirts. You name it, they got it. I mentioned Father's Day and my favorite shirt, and I'm waiting to get this now. They just came out with it. It's a dad joke one. It's in honor of the 1980 Phillies. It says 80 Phillies with a picture of 80 Phillies on it. If you know, you know. But go to phillygoat.com. Use the promo code Jim Montgomery for 10% off of your order. Treat yourself. Treat your uncle, your dad, whoever, your brother. But again, go treat yourself. I bought shirts off of there. Make sure it has the Philly Goat on the patch. It's a good conversation piece. And use that promo code Jim Montgomery for 10% off your order. All right, so for this week's episode, I wanted to talk a little bit about a period in time in the Phillies' history. We're taking a break from the Sixers and moving out, where a lot of people don't talk about. And one, they were a horrible team, but a lot went down. And if you watch any Phillies game today, you'll hear T-Mac and whoever, whether it's Kruk, whether it's Ben Davis on Sundays with Schmidt, whatever it is, they one of the big Philly sponsors right now is points bets, and they'll give you the latest odds. Phillies opened the game at minus 110, and now they're minus 250 or whatever it may be. And it's just, at this point, we're in our society, gambling and betting on games is just part of it. It wasn't always that way. At one point in time, it was just in Vegas and Atlantic City were the only place you could legally gamble. And obviously that led to a lot of underground bookies and things like that. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and say I'm a saint. Like I've had a couple bookies throughout my day. But it's a big thing today in the news because, one, you can't go and watch any sporting event without seeing an advertisement for whether it's DraftKings, PointsBet, FanDuel, you name it, whatever your pick is, Caesars, FoxBet. We're surrounded by it, but it wasn't always that way. And now you have NFL players who are getting suspended, some of them for betting on sports that are not the NFL, but because they're doing it in team facilities. So it's so interwoven. And again, it was not always like that. The first time there was a real huge betting scandal or gambling scandal, where, and I'm trying to talk too much at once, but that was the Black Sox back in 1919 when the White Sox were alleged to have thrown the World Series, like 7 of them or 8. I forget whether it was 8 or 9, because they made a movie, and I think it was 9 men out. So maybe 9 of them were involved with basically taking money from bookies to throw the World Series in a sense, and allowing the Reds to win because the White Sox were such heavily favored in that series. The most notable was Shoeless Joe Jackson, who admitted to taking the money, and then he recanted that statement, and nobody really knows for sure what happened. And I guess if you do the research or you know the story, and if you look at it, I mean, the dude hit 375 in the World Series when he was quote unquote throwing the game. I think ultimately the way the story came out, or what he said, was yeah, he took the money, and then he said he didn't. But either way, he didn't necessarily throw it. But that was kind of and they're all banned. Shoeless Joe Jackson would have been and probably should have been a Hall of Famer, but because of this scandal, he's not. Everybody knows Pete Rose. The Philly connection there was what he played for the Phillies, but basically Pete Rose was suspended and banned for life, and he's now allowed to participate, I think, in certain Major League Baseball things. Like, I think that he was there for when the Phillies celebrated one of their World Series team, when the Reds did. But he's not allowed to be in the Hall of Fame, even though he's one of the best hitters, if not the best hitter to ever play the game. He has the most hits ever, but he's not allowed because he bet on his own team. And obviously, yes, you can't do that, but at least in his case, he was betting on them to win. It wasn't like he was betting on them to lose, and then as manager of the team making decisions. So at least he had the wherewithal to, I guess, overvalue his team or whatever it was. But he was banned for life, and when I was a kid, that was like a huge deal because I knew Pete Rose as the guy that finally put the Phillies over the top to win the World Series, much like we've talked about Moses Malone being that guy for the Sixers. And to have him not be able to be in the Hall of Fame, even though the numbers support, he's one of the top probably 10 at least, maybe top 5 players ever to play. It's kind of insane. But that happened in the 80s, late 80s. So you had 1919, the Black Sox scandal. Then you had Pete Rose. But little does anyone know, and I never knew this until relatively recently, in between there was a guy named William Cox. And you probably never heard of him. But hopefully we're going to shed some light tonight on William Cox and the story of the owner of the Phillies who was banned for life for betting on his team. So to give you a little bit of the backstory, by 1943, the Phillies were the laughingstock of the league. I mean, they were terrible. In 1942, they won 42 games and lost 109. So think about it, let that sink in. They won 42 games. Right now, as bad as the Phillies are, they're almost at 30 wins. So they went a whole season, and I think it was a 154-game season, but they had 42 wins. So the owner at the time decided to drop the Phillies nickname and just call them the Phils. And the idea was to get rid of the stank and the whatever was going on with the team, and just start over fresh and start over new, and they were just the Phils. There were, I guess, the people at the time said they were getting rid of the lies, I guess, whatever that means. But they were in debt. They owed the National League over $125,000. So I don't know where that came from or what happened with that. For the most part, there's not a lot out there on this, and I found 3 or 4 sources that had slightly different versions, but the general gist. So I'm kind of just paraphrasing the 4 of them. I mean, there was more than 4 sites, but every site basically quoted the same 2 or 3 articles. So a lot of this is generalization because I don't know why it's not and I couldn't even find much in the Philly newspapers from my newspaper.com account. And I don't know if it was because it was such a sports were not as big as they are now. Like something like this would be front page. Like if Daniel Snyder, for instance, even though he doesn't own the Washington Commanders anymore, if Daniel Snyder did something like this, it would be all over all news outlets, all sports and everything. But it was sort of almost a one-day story and then almost forgot about, I guess. But anyway, back to the Phillies in 1942. Attendance was horrible. At one point, the end of that season, they had 200 fans come to a game. And basically, the league was like, all right, this is terrible. It's a bad look. We're taking over. And so essentially, they bought out as a lot of the minority owners of the ownership group. And by doing that, they owned the team and they forced the majority owner out, and then they were looking for a new owner. It's kind of like what's going on in Oakland right now. I mean, they're averaging 2,000 fans, I think. They're trying to move to Vegas. Vegas City Council it's a mess there, minus the league taking over. But I have to question whether the American League is that far, or Major League Baseball is that far from taking over the Oakland A's because of how shittily run the organization is. But I digress. So the National League was looking to basically find an owner or an ownership group to buy the Phillies from them and essentially take over their debt. And by all of that, like, I don't understand the financials of it because it was very vague and I saw a lot of different prices. But ultimately, they were looking for somebody to just take over the team and kind of bring them to prominence because the A's at the time were not necessarily that good either, and they weren't that far out from moving to Kansas City at the time. So Philly was a big market, so they wanted to have a decent team there. So enter this guy, William Cox, who made a ton of money in the lumber industry. I guess he owned a bunch of lumber yards, yada, yada, yada. Came in, bought the team for roughly $250,000. So now the National League got what it wanted. William Cox was a young guy. He used to play baseball. He got what he's wanted. Everything was set up and ready to go. So more on William Cox. He was a very, I guess you could call it, and I did read every article I read and every source that all of the articles went to. Used the in quotes. This was a nice way to put it. He was quote unquote hands-on. So think about somebody like Jerry Jones, but on steroids. So he came in and wanted to make a splash immediately. Obviously, he was a young guy, brash guy, like, all right, I'm going to come in, I'm going to turn this franchise around, I'm going to be the man. He also happened to be a former college baseball player at Yale, so he thought he knew his shit, and basically he was the smartest person in the room when it came to baseball. Essentially, he's a genius. First thing he had to do when he came in as owner of the team was search for a manager. Did not take him too long to get in trouble with the league, and you're going to sense and see a pattern here as we get into this story, but he wanted to have a big name, wanted to make a splash. And again, I go back to Jerry Jones, but similar to what he did when he hired Jimmy Johnson. So right now, he was looking at a couple different guys, but Bill Dickey and Bucky Harris were like the two big names that he was looking for to be the manager of this team. Problem with Bill Dickey was he was still an active player. He was the catcher for the Yankees. And if you know anything about the Yankees, just because it's 2023 and everybody has their opinion on the Yankees, guess what? Even before George Steinbrenner, back then, the Yankees were the Yankees. And they're like, no, you're not messing with our team. You're not. This guy's still an active player. Accused him of tampering and went to the press and went to the league and everything about it, which essentially started William Cox having a war of words with the New York press, which is something that ultimately would plague him his entire time he was the owner of the Phillies, because they ripped this guy. They made fun of him. Basically everything you can imagine and you see now on the news with politics and everything. That's what the press in New York was doing to William Cox. So obviously he did not take Bill Dickey as his manager. He went with Bucky Harris. Still not a bad choice. Everything's good. Everything. We're ready for the season. Spring training starts. Here we go. So I mentioned before that William Cox thought he was the smartest guy in the room. He thought he knew everything. Again, this is not supposed to be a bash Jerry Jones, but I'm trying to hammer home the point that this is the kind of guy he was. But then he took it to a new level, and a new level of, if you will, douchebaggery. And so he would come down to the field, put on a Phillies uniform, and take batting practice with the players as the owner of the team. As much as we hate some of the owners that are our rivals' owners, I could never see anyone doing that. Anyone in the league. I couldn't see Jerry Jones going down and throwing passes to Dez Bryant or Michael Irvin or trying to tackle Emmitt Smith. I just can't see. I can't see Josh Harris coming down and shooting around with Joel Embiid during the game. Like, you're the owner, sit in the owner box, let everybody do their things. But this is just kind of painting a picture here of what William Cox was. And the douchebaggery didn't stop there. He would go into the locker room and offer advice to his players. Hey, man, why don't you try to hit the ball to left field here? Which, I mean, we see owners do that all the time now. But it was in direct contradiction of Bucky Harris, who's like, no, pull the ball to right field. So you can see where Bucky Harris is not going to like this. The league had to punish him a few times for fighting with umpires. Not physically, I don't think. It just, all the article said fighting. I'm assuming that just meant arguing. But if you get the picture here, wouldn't put it past him to be fighting umpires. So obviously, Bucky Harris is not going to like this. And I mean, I wouldn't like it if my boss, who hired me to do a job, was coming in to my office and telling my team to do something that I was telling them not to. But either way, we start the 93 or 43 season, and the Phillies are playing better than they've played in years. They're over 500 at the midway point of the year, like heading into like July 4th, the All-Star break. And then the bottom fell out. They went on a streak where they lost 24 of 35 games. And then all of a sudden, tensions get high. Yeah, obviously, when you go on a losing streak like that, the players are on edge. The manager's on edge. You got an owner who's very, very hands-on. So William Cox is getting mad. Whether or not it was justified or not, he fired Bucky Harris and brought in a guy named Freddie Fitzsimmons. All right, no big deal. I mean, he's trying to win. I mean, the team was good and they went on a slump. I mean, I don't necessarily think I would have fired him at this point in the season, but hey, to each his own, it makes sense. The issue is he never told Bucky Harris that he was fired. So Bucky Harris found out because word, whether it was Cox or whoever, the media found out, and a reporter called Bucky Harris for a comment. And Bucky Harris is like, what the fuck are you talking about? I didn't get fired. And he's like, yeah, you did. You got fired. So basically, he found out from the reporter that he got fired. We already know that Bucky Harris was not a big fan of William Cox. We already know William Cox is a douchebag to begin with. So what's going to happen? Well, first of all, the players were not happy about it. They weren't happy that in his first season, because they went in a little slump there, that he was fired. Also, the way it happened, they called it Bush League. Like, you don't fire a guy and then not tell him, which I would happen to agree with. So they were that pissed off that they threatened to strike, and we've talked about this before. At this time in the league, if a team did not field a full team, they were fined. So obviously Cox did not want to get fined. And so they're like, okay, you don't want to get fined, make this right. And they're like, we're refusing to dress for the next game. So they're all sitting in the locker room, not getting ready to go out. Finally, Bucky Harris came in to the locker room and said, listen, William Cox came to me. He apologized. He's still a douchebag, but I accept his apology. So that saved everyone from getting fined. And I don't know whether Cox gave him money or not, but whatever, it happened. That wasn't the end of it, though. Harris was kind of a hothead. We know Cox was. So they're arguing through the media back and forth, like more of like he said. He said Cox made a comment about Harris, this, that, and the other. He's not doing his job. Harris is like, you know what? And went on this long rant and basically called him an all-American jerk. And that's what the big takeaway from their fight was, that Cox is an all-American jerk. So with that, the New York media ate that up because they hated Cox. They're like, oh, we finally got something. And they ran the all-American jerk headline, this, that, and the other. And then looking for a comment from Cox, it kind of was a throwaway comment, but at the time, nobody really said anything about it. But because of when he fired him, he's like, fine, I made a bet that we'll still finish higher than any of the other past Philly teams that have been there. And I promise you, we won't finish last. He called out the Cubs. He called out the Yankees. He called out all of these teams and said, we're going to finish better than them. And I made bets on it. Or I bet we're going to finish. I forget the exact quote, but however it was, he basically said, I bet that the Phillies are not going to come in last place. And we're going to be better than what we were last year. So whether it was a literal or he meant it figuratively, he's flat out saying to the media from New York, keep in mind, this is a Philly owner, but like he just had this thing in his crawl for the New York media that he made a bet. And obviously we know with what happened to the Black Sox in 1919, that's not going to go over well for anyone in the league. The commissioner is still the same commissioner. So Harris, meanwhile, is still fuming because he's like, this guy, like, basically picture this dude is your boss. He's undermining you at every turn, then fires you, and then's talking shit to you in the media. He's going to be pissed. So he's like, fuck this dude. So he's using his contacts within the league, and he's working like they called it back channels, but basically going behind the scenes, off the record, whatever you want to call it, trying to find a way to get this guy to get his comeuppance. And there, obviously, with the quote he said about betting, there also were some rumors and rumblings within the Phillies organizations about his betting. And basically, there was enough then that Commissioner Landis, who was the same guy who banned Shoeless Joe Jackson and all the White Sox players during the Black Sox scandal, opened up an investigation on Cox and his gambling. So Harris was pissed, started fanning the flames on all of this stuff, and apparently there was enough because Cox was not very secretive and he wasn't a very good. If he was not trying to get caught, he wasn't, or if he was trying not to get caught, he wasn't good at it. And then he was evasive about it. When people asked him about it, he's like, I don't know, what are you talking about? Or would change the subject or didn't really talk about it. There was enough because once Landis started doing his investigation of all the rumblings and everything inside the Phillies organization, there was enough for him to suspend Cox for life. That November after the season ended, he suspended him for life. And now Cox is like, all right, this is messed up. So he appealed and finally got his day to kind of have his hearing. During his hearing, he downplayed the gambling. But I think where he may have gone wrong is he contradicted himself. First, he said, oh, no, I was just making friendly bets. No, it was just with my buddies, like, bet like poker games, this and that, which technically are illegal, but I'm not betting with a bookie or in Vegas or anything like that. And then he was like, well, when I placed the bets, I was doing it to test employees. I coming into a new team, I didn't trust some of these guys, so I was testing them. How placing bets on anything is going to test your employees, I don't know, but this was his excuse. So, I mean, you have right there, his holes all through his story. But then there was a couple employees that started to speak out that, yeah, he was making money and betting on the Phillies. And as soon as that happened, all hell broke loose. So it turned out one of the biggest people who put the final nail in his coffin was Bucky Harris. The last person to testify was Bucky Harris. So he told a story. He made a trip to New York with some other team employee earlier in the season, I guess before he was fired. William Cox's secretary, Miss Massey, she had placed a call while the two guys were there. So she was there. She made a call. Bucky Harris and the other Phillies employee were right there. And she was asking for the odds on that day's game. Like, hey, what's the line, basically, or what are the odds? And then Bucky Harris was like, what the hell is going on? And, like, confused. He's like, what were the odds, he asked, just out of curiosity. He was like, she said 13-5 on Brooklyn. And then at that point, everything changed now. Because as he's testifying all of this, like, it could have been anything. It could have been the odds on a horse race, which was legal, or the odds on this. But no, it was specifically 13-5 Brooklyn. And he said, he clarified. He wanted to make sure he was hearing this right. Do you mean to tell me that Cox is betting on baseball? And then Miss Massey was like, oh, I thought you knew that. I have to keep a whole book on it. And at that point, Cox was done. Landis stood his ground. He upheld Cox's ban for life, and that was the end. And I feel like this is something out of like a mob movie, like the books kill you. And the fact that I don't know. Like, I don't know whether he would have been pissed at Miss Massey or whatever it is, but this is the gambling scandal that I've never heard of. And maybe you have, and this is, but like, this is amazing. Like, this whole story is amazing. So William Cox buys the team, comes in, is going to save the Phillies franchise and turn them into a prominent contender. Betting on the Phillies, I'm assuming it never did say whether he was taking the Phillies against Brooklyn or he was betting against them. I kind of think the way his personality was, he's like, nah, we're going to be good, this, that, and the other, or we're going to break this streak. But he let his gambling get the best of him. He let his douchebaggery get the best of him, and ultimately that was what his undoing was. So what was the outcome of all this other than Cox being banned for life? So I feel like if this was a mob movie, it would have ended with Commissioner Landis saying, I upheld your ban for life. You will never do anything in Major League Baseball again, William Cox. And then it would start rolling the whatever music you want to hear, and then the black and white photos, and it would say 10 years later, epilogue. So here's the epilogue of this story. The Phillies team control went back to the National League. They did it all over again the next year. They looked for a new ownership group to buy the team. That ownership group did come in. A guy named Bill Carpenter was named president. The Carpenter family ran the team for 37 years. Within 6 years of them taking over, the Whiz Kids won the pennant, went to the World Series for the first time since 1915. They kind of went through up and down periods through the 60s and 70s, and then starting in 76, they went on a run of 3 straight division titles, got to the World Series in 1980, finally won the World Series championship in 1980 before they sold the team to the Bill Giles Group in 1981. Now they would show a picture of William Cox. I'm trying to paint a picture here for you guys. Cox, he was not done in sports ownership or being involved in running leagues or things like that. He helped create the International Soccer League. He also launched the National Professional Soccer League, which eventually merged with the United Soccer Association to create the North American Soccer League. So ultimately, he was still able to own sports. I don't know whether he was gambling on soccer, whether he was able to still gamble on baseball, whatever it was. But that is ultimately how this ended. So William Cox was banned, but was able to own a team. I think he said he died sometime in the 80s. I got a lot of the information, ironically enough, from his obituary. So everybody knows about the Black Sox scandal of 1919. Everybody knows about Pete Rose. Now you know about William Cox. The Phillies have their own gambling scandal, betting scandal, whatever you want to call it. And it's just, to me, funny now looking at watching a Phillies game and seeing the points bet, odds of the game. Here's the prop bet of the day and Zach Wheeler strikeouts. But back in 1943, William Cox was banned for life, was forced to sell the Phillies, which ultimately excuse me, which ultimately worked out for the Phillies. They went to win the pennant, and eventually it took almost 40 years, but they did win their World Series. All right, next week, not sure what the episode's going to be yet. I'm in a transition period here in June. I know what some of the things I'm going to do for July and on, but I have an idea, a couple ideas, but we'll see. So stay tuned for that. Excuse me. Oh my goodness, between allergies and this smoke, man. But stay tuned for that. The best way to stay in touch with what's going to happen is like and subscribe to the podcast. Get it delivered right to your inbox as soon as I post it. Check out also This Day in Philly Sports History. Every day I have that posted by about 8, 9 o'clock, usually a lot earlier during the week. I'll keep you updated on that. For June, it's rivalry month. We've been doing spotlights on Philly teams' biggest rivals. Be sure you can also check me out on social media, YouTube, TikTok, Twitter, Jimbo_Mont, Instagram, Philly Jimbo. And there you have it. Don't forget to check out phillygoat.com for your Father's Day Philly sports apparel. Tell me what you think about William Cox. Did he get was it fair? Did he get what he deserved? I don't know. If he's doing that, were other owners doing that and he was just a douchebag and got caught? I don't know. But this has been Back to the Future. I'm Jim Montgomery. Go have yourselves a week, and until next time, I will see you when I see you.